Parthenon, where we discuss the place of the ethno-nationalists. So I first heard about this wing of the alt-right in 2011 with the alt-right website, which was Annie Nowicki, Colin Liddell, and Richard Spencer. Now, at that point, it was still more of a big tent. You had your reactionaries, you had some manosphere types. But ultimately, I think in no small measure due to Hillary Clinton's statement about the basket of deplorables, the ethno-nationalist element became synonymous with the alt-right itself. So maybe you could sort of begin by giving a bit of a backstory about that.
Well, I think that the link between the new right and ethno-nationalism dates back to really the early days of the paleo-conservative movement, where there was a kind of adjunct of paleo-conservatism embodied by people like Sam Francis and Jared Taylor, which basically was not entirely ethno-nationalist the way we conceive of it today, but it was part of the AmRen project and of the movement known as race realism. Now, this is something that later dwindled under the paleocons as they kind of retreated to their ivory tower in Rockford, Illinois. And I remember reading an article in the American Conservative saying that we would be fine with paleo-conservatives as long as they had remained paleo-conservatives and not spent all of their time quoting Chesterton and Nietzsche all day. So I think that then in 2007, I believe, Paul Gottfried issued a speech at the H.L. Mencken Club, basically calling for a new alternative right. And as much as Paul Gottfried has tried to distance himself from the ethno-nationalists, being Jewish after all, since then, it was clear that what he was calling for possessed some degree of race realism. That is, he was complaining about the degree to which the paleocons had drifted off into abstraction at the expense of potential race realist criticisms of the modern paradigm. And so in calling for the new alternative right, this paved the way for the alternative right website and Richard Spencer's project, where he basically took Paul Gottfried's call for a new alternative right and developed it into something that went beyond a revival of paleo-conservative race realism into a kind of full-fledged right Hegelian ethno-nationalism. From there, the movement, I think, came under this broad tent period that you're referring to. After that, when Hillary's speech helped the alt-right, some members of the alt-right gain in popularity, partly due to the fact that the media wished to slander the alt-right more generally by associating them with neo-Nazis. The ethno-nationalist portion of the alternative right was able to rise to the forefront. And from there, I think there arose a situation where there was a kind of dichotomy, which is something that you allude to in your very first video, I believe, where you basically have the moderate white nationalists associated with things like AmRen and perhaps what was left over from the alternative right website. Then you have the more kind of generic white nationalists who are moderately authoritarian, people like Tara McCarthy, Millennial Woes, Richard Spencer at that time, Greg Johnson at maybe his more sober moments. Basically, I think that is what is the most representative form of ethno-nationalism as it existed circa 2016. And then, of course, you also have the Daily Stormer National Socialist variety of ethno-nationalism. Now, for one reason or another, ever since Charlottesville, the white nationalists have kind of gone underground to an extent. And it seems to me that the movement has lingered on, but it's in a kind of new depressive phase where they still reject civic nationalism. They don't like Trump. But they also severely dislike Richard Spencer and dislike the term alt-right. And they've become sort of what I call barbecue white nationalists. That is, they're kind of like people who watch Nick Fuentes and live out and speak of ethno-nationalist visions for society that almost seem in tone as if they would be fitted less to something so quixotically European and something that fits more into an American suburb. So I have to say that the cultural ethos of ethno-nationalism is in some kind of recession at the moment, but it's still out there.
In another sense, while these elements were not necessarily a part of the original creation process of the alt-right, beginning in the post-war era, you had the American National Socialist movement led by George Lincoln Rockwell, culminating with the terrorist activities of the Order in the Pacific Northwest. And then you had the Second Klan in the 1920s and then the Third Klan in the 1970s. Now, these elements were not necessarily behind the rise of the alt-right, but they were more than happy to collaborate with it. So, for example, hardcore National Socialists like Harold Covington were favorably looked upon by countercurrents. So, for example, when he wrote his Northwest Quartet series, there was actually quite a few reviews of his books by countercurrents. Now, they might have criticized him for tactics and abrasiveness, but he was basically one of us. And then, of course, David Duke, famous member of the KKK, famous for his Senate or governor positions in Louisiana in the 80s, also jumped on this as well. Of course, he was involved in Charlottesville. So, while again, these groups may not have been initially a part of or behind the alt-right, they certainly were able to. They were certainly a flavor of ethno-nationalism that predated the alt-right that was more than happy to merge with it. Do you have anything to add on that?
Well, I do. My position is that there is an ideological distinctiveness between these groups. And I think that there is a reason that people like both Jared Taylor and Richard Spencer have taken not necessarily pains to distance themselves, but a sort of a cold glance, as it were. And I think that in some ways this is because of what they view as a sort of Americanism or vulgarity that they would attribute to earlier forms of white nationalism. On the part of someone like Jared Taylor, it's also because of him simply not being as radical as them. But if you go back one step further even, and you look at the origins of the Ku Klux Klan, right? In its initial conception, it was a kind of Southern nationalist resistance to Reconstruction. And probably was more representative of, say, Episcopalianism than it was of later manifestations of Southern evangelicals. If I'm not mistaken, the founder of the Ku Klux Klan was an Episcopalian. Nathan Bradford, was it? I can't remember his name. Do you remember?
No, I do not.
Okay. Well, that aside, I'm sure I've got the name wrong, but then in the second iteration, it took on kind of the Ku Klux Klan the way it's referenced in something like To Kill a Mockingbird, where it's this kind of 1920s prohibitionist, decidedly more Protestant form of Southern nationalism that very much reflects what we call the New South. And then in its third iteration, I think the Ku Klux Klan took on a further degree of vulgarity when it became sort of almost like a neocon version of Southern nationalism that I think is more associated with people like David Duke. I think that from the beginning of the ethno-nationalists, as they were associated with both the paleocon movement kind of adjunctly and then later the ethno-nationalists, I think that there was an effort to distinguish themselves as being more connected to their European roots, to being more erudite, to being more, wrongly or rightly, and to being less American, I think, and more distance from the American political paradigm. For example, David Duke was a big supporter of the war in Vietnam, whereas the contemporary ethno-nationalists are very much critical of the war efforts of the establishment. So I do think that there was an attempt to distance themselves from the kind of low-brow quality that was seen in earlier forms of American ethno-nationalism.
Just to add one point, I think it's a bit easier to explain why someone like David Duke would have been in favor of U.S. imperialism and not the current group of the alt-right, because back then they were fighting communism. And communism would have been seen as a part of the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. So while it might on the surface seem somewhat odd that David Duke would support the war in Vietnam, within a broader clannish or neo-Nazi worldview, it does make sense.
Sure, I mean, and there's nothing unusual about that. After all, there were traditionalists and paleocons who said good things about the war in Vietnam for exactly the same reason. But I would just argue that there is, I suppose, a lower resolution that was in place at the time. And by that I mean, like, even though she was Jewish, you will hear David Duke say good things about Ayn Rand as kind of part of the sort of 80s, 70s movement towards conservative freedom reacting against socialism. So I do believe that there was more of a, at the very least, a kind of aesthetic affiliation with American conservatism.
True, and whereas the current alt-right is much more iconoclastic in that regard, trying to distance itself from what is considered mainstream conservatism.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's really what I had to say about that particular point of the development of white nationalism.
Well, and within the current 2011 and onward incarnation of this, we have what you mentioned, the more moderate white nationalists or ethno-nationalists, someone like a Jared Taylor, where he was once asked, what do you think of Jews? And he said, Jews are white. Well, that's an anathema with most white nationalists. But to some extent, I think that's what allows Jared Taylor to have a wider audience. I think he was on the Phil Donahue show at one point. So is that right?
That is correct. Now, this is during the period where the paleoconservative phase of ethno-nationalism, kind of associated with people like himself, like maybe the more advanced, let's call it, elements of something like VDARE or of, say, Kevin MacDonald in his earlier days, like the sort of sociological race realist, basically what Richard Spencer has dismissed as what was the alt-right, namely race realist libertarianism plus sociology. And I remember Richard Spencer on Tree of Logic dismissing that as if it were a bad thing. Like, look at all these dry race realist libertarians plus sociology. Well, that seems like a perfectly sensible combination of opinions to me compared to some of the things that have followed it. I think that to an extent it has to do with the fact that Jared Taylor has more palatable views. But to an extent, I also think it has to do with the fact that the popular culture had not radicalized as far as that at that point. And of course, he was not treated very well at all by Phil Donahue, who does not have a very good record of treating his guests very well. He had David Duke on, in the 80s or the 70s. So I think he just likes to get people on to shout at them. He did the same thing with Ayn Rand. But in terms of Jared Taylor's approach, I mean, I think that this would maybe provide a decent segue into the topic of defining white ethno-nationalism, because one of the problems with it, and one of the reasons I think it may lack appeal to some people, is because it hasn't quite defined its terms. And I think that's because it wants to put out two messages at the same time. And I think that this can constitute a bait and switch fallacy, which is something that the left itself on race is very notorious for. On the one hand, I think that the ethno-nationalists want to say, we are just like normal people. We're just like your great-grandparents. We just want a place for our people. We just want things to go back to normal and for people to have normal instincts about racial difference. And that could appeal to a lot of people. But then they also want to say, plus it means all of this other stuff. So once they've established that someone is a white nationalist, then it means like ethnic collectivism and expatriation of non-white citizens and this kind of thing. And so there comes to be a certain difficulty with someone like Jared Taylor or Sam Francis as to whether they actually can be ethno-nationalists, because it's not entirely clear what the parameters of white nationalism are.
Exactly. Now, this might be because of the fact that Harold Covington was so strident and so radical. But if you look at the picture he paints in his Northwest Quartet, it is one of the most systematically well thought out alternative systems to the current order that any group outside the Overton window has produced. The possible exception might be some of the libertarian works or objectivist works like, say, Ayn Rand. Nobody else, to my knowledge, has gone into such detail. So at least I think and of course, he was in many ways the last of the old guard of the American neo-Nazi movement. And with his passing, that's really just dead in the water. Because at this point, it's just people LARPing the aesthetic. Whereas someone like William Luther Pierce, who's also now deceased, and the late Harold Covington, they really stood for that. And in that sense, I think ethno-nationalism in that context has a lot more clear boundaries of what's in and what's out. Someone like a Richard Spencer, a Greg Johnson, even the two Matts when they were around with the Traditional Workers' Party, TWP, there was a lot less, well, like you said, there was a sort of a bait and switch on what they meant by race. I guess you could say at least the neo-Nazis were upfront and clear about what they believed without beating around the bush too much. These other ethno-nationalists are like, well, maybe this, maybe that, not really sure. So what are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, in addition to Rothbard and Ayn Rand having heavily abstracted elucidations of their philosophy, I think another contender might be the neo-Thomists, who were very kind of rigorous in outlining a very specific theological interpretation of how things should be arranged politically, which is where I think Rothbard and Rand got a lot of their inclination to do things this way. In relation to this notion of the bait and switch with respect to the definition of race itself, much like the way the left use the bait and switch in order to decide whether someone is a racist, they set the bar very, very low. And then once they want to define what a racist means, they set it very high. So all you need to be a racist on the left is, by the left's terms, is to believe and hold any kind of the most basic racial prejudice. But then once they've established that you're a racist, then the definition becomes very more specific, and you're a neo-Nazi and you want to exterminate people and what have you. But an example, a very striking example, and I have to laugh at this, is that Millennial Woes, who I like, by the way, I watch his channel, but in his debate with Sargon, he was debating the parameters of race, and he kept saying to Sargon, we all know what white is. Why are we debating this? And he named some black celebrity and he said, what race is he? And Sargon kind of beat around the bush, but eventually he said he was black, and Millennial Woe said, yes, he is. We all know what white is. We all know what black is. But then when they get into a situation where they're asked, are Ashkenazi Jews white? Their answer is invariably absolutely not. So there is a very, I suppose, a suspiciously strategical approach to how they define things. And I think that really going forward, the best strategy would probably be to make it clear what your position is and say, or whether this is the best I think this is the best long-term strategy in terms of not alienating potential participants in your cause, is to say, okay, there is a vagueness in the definition of what constitutes white nationalism. And maybe we have two definitions out there. One potentially could be that you believe in race, that you want freedom of speech to talk about race, that you want equality under the law for citizens, or you want basically for ethnicity to be a factor in considering the parameters of migration. However, this is something that has to be discussed in relation to the elephant in the room, which is the question of the repatriation of citizens. And there's something very underhanded about ethno-nationalists discussing their position as if all they wanted was the package that I've just described, when in fact there is this implicit question of the necessity of repatriating citizens on the basis of ethnicity, which of course undermines the entire constitutional fabric of a given society with respect to its citizens. I mean, the way I would put it to them is in this way. If you engage in a policy of repatriation of citizens, that means that the state is able to uncitizenize people. What kind of government would that leave white people to contend with after the fact? At the very least, this is something that cannot be only an implicit or indirect part of the conversation, but this, in any responsible ideological discussion of this, that issue must be front and center. Because if it isn't, then not only are you not being explicit in terms of what the definition of your specific ideology is, but in fact, you may be leading white people towards a situation where the means by which they have attained their end that you've sold them is by entertaining a system which is fundamentally at odds with what they have come to expect from a tolerant society.
Well, exactly. And this sort of, you've mentioned this before in other contexts, but again, let's go back to millennial woes. There's this discussion about, well, we are being silenced. We are not having our freedom of speech respected. And you'll see across the board, white nationalist thinkers, especially after the purge, after Charlottesville, saying that, look, the liberal society is a fake. They don't believe in freedom of speech, and we demand our rights to freedom of speech. Well, I mean, if you have a state that powerful, that authoritarian, is that going to be that can decitizenize people and repatriate them? Is that the kind of state that's going to respect your freedom of speech?
Well, right. That's a very important point, is that many of the grievances that they claim or that they attribute, many of the abuses that they attribute, rather, to the current system are things which would be exponentially worse in the kind of societies that they're advocating. Now, you cannot get away from this by simply explaining away the problem as, well, maybe there's a risk of that, of there being greater censorship, but it's worth the survival of our people, and hopefully it won't be there. Well, no, you can't say that, because here's the problem. It's not just a risk. It is an empirical one-to-one match that every society that approximates what you are advocating has stronger censorship than what we are enjoying at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. So that then begs the question, do they really value freedom of speech, or are they using freedom of speech as kind of like a cloak to operate within the broader liberal system, because that's an acceptable way to voice your objections?
Well, I think it depends on the individual. I think with someone like Millennial Woes, it is certainly a genuine desire for freedom of speech, if somewhat inconsistent. And I think that for many of them, it's very much something that fails to look beyond the horizon, I think. That is, they just see the problem that YouTube and Facebook aren't allowing them to say certain things, and Twitter, and so therefore they must be allowed to, those institutions must be made to observe their freedom of speech. Now, there is, I think this is just a general problem. I wouldn't lay this at the feet of white nationalists specifically, but people tend to confuse their momentary pragmatic interests with their long-term interests, as well as their general principles. So that is, if there's a question of something like an Internet Bill of Rights, and they see that as the big question of the day, they can't separate that from the problems that may arise in the future because of that. And they can't separate that from their general philosophical stance. So I think from both a pragmatic and from both a pragmatic and a philosophical point of view or ethical point of view, these are highly questionable fixations in relation to what would be possible in the kind of societies that they're advocating.
Yes. Another sort of oddity is, on the one hand, a common, almost overwhelmingly dominant portion of the ethno-nationalist narrative is the superiority of the white man with regards to science and technology, high trust, clean, orderly societies versus everyone else. But then they'll say, well, look, even if white people had IQs as low as Africans, we'd still want to preserve white people because they're our people. And then furthermore, they advocate systems of government, as we've been talking about, that are by definition low trust forms of government. The reason why autocracy is universal is because low trust societies are universal. And so there's this sort of catch-22 where you can't have your cake and eat it. You can't, on the one hand, say the white race is awesome and special, and that's why we're for it, because of all these superlative qualities that it has. And then, on the one hand, advocate policies that would make those superlative qualities impossible to express, and or say, well, even if we didn't have them, it wouldn't matter. They're still our people.
Right. Well, that's a very interesting point. And I think that, to be fair to them, I think that the people who advocate the more end of history argument for a preference for their group based on empirical evidence are distinct from the people who say, I support them because they're my people, and maybe it's not about the prosperity. And I remember in the old Vanguard podcasts, Richard Spencer was basically complaining of identitarianism because it was based on things like low crime and high IQ, and I guess Richard Spencer was saying that he wanted a society that was more akin to a more high T, more pre-industrial form of society, which I think is, I mean, I see the benefits of the Jared Taylor model almost immediately. And this is one of the reasons that I have to, I mean, what I would say is that far from being inconsistent, I think a lot of the white nationalists have shown their true colors on this and have basically said, we need to stop talking about IQ. We need to stop talking about statistical differences, and we need to start talking about, you know, the spirit of the race and about the more qualitative, subjective aspects of the society. And this is why I kind of have to laugh when people try to, like, people on the right, like normie conservatives criticize Richard Spencer for being a racist liberal. And I think that that's kind of very incorrect, because for one, I mean, if he thinks that all groups are, that if he thinks that he would support his people regardless of who they were, and that it's not necessarily about any objectively superior qualities, but is about this kind of group loyalty, in-group preference, well, that's not particularly racist. And secondly, if he's some kind of national socialist or, you know, quasi-socialist collectivist, well, he's not a liberal. He's neither racist nor a liberal. And, you know, as a kind of professing racist liberal myself, I'm very unhappy about this attribution being afforded to Richard Spencer when he really doesn't deserve it.
And one of the things that, yeah, you do seem to be correct in that it's older generation that played up the IQ, the high trust. Though I would say that Greg Johnson has been known to play both cards, depending on what suits his purposes. He may be the one that I was thinking of when it comes to the contradiction of saying that. But if you're just going to reduce it to the spirit of the race, we look the same, therefore we're the same. I mean, obviously, you can see the utility of looking at statistics of crime and IQ and performance as a way to appeal to people at some sort of rational level to convince them that you're right. And so, for example, in a totally non-race related way, the libertarians have been extremely successful because they have taken a very rationalist, hard-nosed approach to persuading people. They're like, look, free markets are really good in all these areas, and here's all the evidence for it. And we're just going to privatize everything because if it's good over there, it's going to be good over here. Now, again, I have disagreements with that, but what they have done, though, is they've taken a very sort of rationalistic point of view where they prove everything out. They start from a set of rigid first principles, and they have had tremendous success doing so. Whereas a kind of like more emotional, subjective, mystical approach, I don't see being very effective in the United States. And I think it's somewhat odd that the alt-right would take that over the more, say, Jared Taylor-esque, facts and logic position.
Well, unfortunately, I don't share what might be a certain optimism on your part, because I am worried that in the eventuality that things devolved and were requiring a new paradigm, that people might go off in all kinds of crazy directions, right? If the society is able to accept that there are 56 genders, or however many there are now, then I can't imagine it would be that difficult for, under circumstances of extreme pressure, them latching on to the vision of someone like Greg Johnson. I don't think that that's a good thing, but I think we have to be able to consider the possibility, just so that we're not naive about the situation. I think that first and foremost, what's important about the older generation of race realists, who were kind of, as I've said previously, a sort of adjunct to the paleocon movement. And I think the real missing link here is Sam Francis, as kind of the sort of transitional figure between the paleocons and the alt-right. I think it's simply that it represents at least some kind of outcome that we wouldn't all find intolerable. And I want to just, not to beat this to death, but just to really emphasize the problems inherent in overlooking this question of this regarding the status of citizenship. In 2016, Ramsey Paul was interviewed by someone from some mainstream news outlet, right? And he kept being asked, well, you were talking about an ethno-state, but I mean, that ship has already sailed. So how do we get that? You can't just get that by by restricting immigration. So, I mean, do you want to, would you entertain the idea of basically de-citizenizing people or deporting citizens? And Ramsey Paul just refused to answer the question. And now, granted, this was a rather obnoxious leftist reporter or mainstream reporter who was talking to him, and he was trying to get him, as it were. But it really, and a problem, I think, one of the reasons that he failed to do so was because he was asking Ramsey Paul the question in a rather obnoxious way. He was saying, well, what do you do then? What do you do if they don't want to leave? And he was being rather abrasive about it. But really, the question that he should have put to Ramsey Paul was, yes, we all know that there might be some situations where who knows what has to happen, right? We might have to create an entirely new society. Maybe there'll be a secession, who knows? But the way he should have put the question to him, and the way I would put the question to someone like Ramsey Paul is this: would you hope and would you try to find an outcome where non-white citizens who wanted to stay would be allowed to stay, provided that they really were citizens? And I think that is a question that has to be put to people very directly if we want to have an honest discussion about what the actual intentions of white nationalism are.
Yeah, it reminds me of the variation of the question that Sargon of Akkad asked in the same tone to Millennial Woes. And Millennial Woes deflected much like Ramsey Paul did. I think the problem that is appearing here is that even if a question is asked with ill intent by the interlocutor, one, that doesn't mean it isn't a good question. And two, at some point, you're going to have to answer that question.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that some people will be put off, at least people who could be of potential value to the movement, by the fact that the question isn't being answered, right? I mean, not everyone is stupid. I mean, someone like Lucy Brown, who had a large following and was involved with people like Tommy Robinson and Sargon, and also knew Mark Collett, and was kind of, for a time, in between the ethno-nationalists and the alt-right. I think that in her public conversations, it became very clear that she had become frustrated by this question of, well, what is the ethno-state, right? If I'm going to cooperate or sign up with something called ethno-nationalism, well, I want to know what it is first. And I think people may be frustrated by the fact that they don't know what it is. And also, there's a problem strategically from their point of view, right? If you really care about the white race, if you really care about getting some of your propositions, at least to get a public hearing, at least in the alternative sphere of things, right? You at the very least, if you have some people who are articulating that, yes, we would consider restricting immigration on this basis. Yes, we want the repeal of basically all forms of social engineering, like non-discrimination, that kind of thing. But on this issue, granted that all of this is on the table, we do not intend on decitizenizing someone. Well, simply giving that position some kind of vocal articulation, I think would put a lot of people at ease who might otherwise not want anything to do with you.
Yeah, exactly. One I think thing of note is how the ethno-nationalists rub shoulders, or rather, I should say, rub the other elements of the Parthenon the wrong way. The first sort of friction appeared with NRX, where they were saying that no, Moldbug isn't enough. You need a more robust idea of race and ethnicity, rather than just a more generic HBD conceptualization. And I had a small hand in that, getting that conflict set up. I don't know how many people remember, but I was involved in some flaming wars with Matthew Parrott. And when I was involved in that, there were some near reactionaries that I knew that I directed to Matt Parrott as well to sort of stir things up a little bit. But that was more petty, not a serious division between the NRX and the ethno-nationalists. A far more serious conflict originated with the manosphere. Specifically, when someone like Roosh V was bragging about his luck with the white ladies, and that a lot of these white nationalists were incels. And that led to a pretty acrimonious public breakup between two groups that up to that point had been more or less not on the same page necessarily, but happy to consider each other allies.
Right. I mean, it does seem like there is a tendency sort of focusing on the earlier part of what you said, not to get too distracted into the question of the manosphere, but with respect to the conflict with NRX, I mean, this competition to see who can hold out the vision which most people would find least tolerable in terms of affecting their everyday lives is a very bad PR strategy when it comes to normal people. I mean, I wouldn't want to see the right compete with one another in terms of who's going to get us closer to the sticks and stones, as it were.
Yeah, it's sort of, I guess, an occupational hazard. Much like on the far left as well with the infighting. Now, of course, Charlottesville itself dealt first of all, the Donald Trump campaign, coupled with Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables statement, sort of catapulted the alt-right to national awareness in a way that it hadn't before. And then, of course, that ultimately culminated in Charlottesville, which has led to a remission of the alt-right, especially after the series of purges. But that's been discussed, I think, by us and people in general quite a lot. One interesting element underneath that is the sort of internal tactical dispute between those who are in favor of activism and vanguardism. So, for example, Greg Johnson wrote an article called Vantardism, where he criticized the vanguardists. And they tend to be more inspired by the American Nazi movement and the Ku Klux Klan and those iterations of ethno-nationalism. And then there's a different strategy, the one where it's more like prim and proper scholarly types, think of like AmRan or the League of the South and other groups like that, where they try to put forward a more intellectual and respectable approach. And then I guess there's a third way, which, while it starts with NRX, does bleed over into the alt-right. Ethno-nationalism is passivism, PASSIVISM, where you just sort of withdraw from society and work on self-improvement. There's actually a lot of overlap with MGTOW, the manosphere, on that as well. And those seem to be the three competing strategies. And it would appear that in 2017, the activist strategy was dealt a heavy blow with the reverses of Charlottesville.
Yeah, I think that this regression of the ethno-nationalists was entirely unnecessary. and was really responsive and I think self-inflicted. Now, we've gone into it several times in previous videos, so I'm not going to go into what I think the media's strategy was and how the alt-right responded exactly how the media wanted them to respond, which is basically turning on one another. But I think that to introduce a new aspect to it, and this is something that Greg Johnson has identified correctly, I believe, that is, there was a kind of, I think, immature perception of exactly how fast this entire thing was going to go. That is, I don't really think that when they were saying that the movement was falling apart or it was declining, that it was actually in decline. I think it had just slowed from compared to their expectations in relation to what it had been in 2016. Like, for example, is the subscriber count of Millennial Woes smaller or larger than it was in 2017? Right? Is the readership of Countercurrent smaller or larger? I was also going to ask, is the subscribership of Richard Spencer higher or lower? But that might not be the best rhetorical question. And I think that a large part of really what this looked like, and this is what Johnson was outlining, is that they were able to ride the coattails of Trump and get some success from it. And they probably had a lot of fun, and they saw their subscriber counts going up, their viewership, and they had these events. They had like the late 2016 events at AmRen and at and MPI, and I forget what the Countercurrents actual public forum is called, but all of these events. And then after 2016, they no longer have the steam from Trump. And it's like they suddenly seem disappointed that this momentum was not going to continue ad infinitum. And I think that a large part of it was not so much that anything actually went wrong, it's just that their expectations were totally unrealistic.
I think you can make a far better claim that it was InfoWars and Alex Jones as a media personality that helped Trump than any sort of alt-right memeing.
Yeah, well, and also there's a question as to what extent that memeing, I think the memeing did help, but to what extent was that memeing exclusively ethno-nationalist, right? Because at that time, the big tent was still in place. So many of the memers were just MAGA people or 4chan trolls, or some of them.
Even Sargon of Akkad with Keck.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, yes, I mean, I do think it did help Trump, but I think much more than that, Trump probably helped them.
Yeah, that would definitely seem to be the case. So, in what ways do you see the ethno-nationalist element relating to the other members of the Parthenon?
Oh, well, I think that it is valuable in that it identifies a necessary topic, which is the most controversial topic, it seems, that one can talk about, which are questions of race, right? And in societies where it is basically prohibited to discuss this topic openly, and even now on YouTube, one has to be careful about how one articulates oneself, lest one be ejected from the platform or have their video stricken or what have you. And so in a society where there is a narrative of compulsive anti-racism and where the definition of racism is being constantly revised so that everyone is considered a racist, and where it's considered taboo to be too open about opposing open borders or even advocating that the law be followed. I think that in light of the current dogmas, they serve an extremely important function of actually being willing to entertain this subject of race in relation to the other groups who just rather focus on other issues that are perhaps safer. And I remember Paul Gottfried making fun of this. He said that he's going to be sick if he has to encounter another conservative blog talking about the permanent things, as opposed to discussing things that are actually not allowed to be talked about. So in other words, I think that in light of demographic changes and in light of the required narrative in society, the topic of race is becoming an incredibly important one. And I think that the ethno-nationalists are important and that they're willing to introduce it to the discussion. However, the problem is that they are so stark and so absolutist in their introduction of this topic that they give other aspects of the Parthenon many reasons to not want anything to do with them. And I can give another anecdote about this, where someone like Stefan Molyneux, I think, talks about race in a very reasonable way, and I think in a very necessary way. And Molyneux basically has, well, if anyone follows him, they know that he's a race realist. He's talked to Jared Taylor. He wants it to be a consideration in immigration, right? He's not a lightweight on this topic. But I remember the people on Millennial Woes when these development and you'll have to forgive me for always referencing Millennial Woes, but it's such a great hub of the alt-right because so many people are on it. They're having these big millennial conversations. It's a good way to get inside of it. And this wasn't him saying it anyway, that basically Stefan, that is, why isn't he just calling himself alt-right? I mean, he's embraced all of our positions. Why not simply call himself alt-right? And I kind of had to throw my hands up and say, well, you're admitting that he's embracing all the positions that you want him to embrace, but you want him to explicitly abandon his libertarianism, I think, because you think that he has not arrived to conclusions that are sufficiently authoritarian. And another example of this is that Stefan Molyneux was complaining about multiracialism, essentially, and saying, if you want a society that protects property, that protects rule of law, that protects all the things that we've been accustomed to, then you have to look past the dogma that populations are inherently replaceable. And instead of applauding this, they were scoffing at it and saying, well, your rule of law is not going to matter too much longer. Your property rights, they won't matter when things break out in a full-on conflict. And it's like, you have encountered someone who has actually made a full transition to race realism and who at various times you have admitted is so close to the alt-right that he should simply start calling himself that. And you're complaining that he still has respect for property rights and the rule of law. That, I think, makes it very clear that there is a hidden agenda here, which is that rather than simply wanting to address the question of race, you want the question of race to be a gateway to something that is just as important to you, which is the entertainment of anti-Western and potentially anti-white authoritarian ideals.
Mm-hmm. What do you see as the probable course of the ethno-nationalist movement in the future, and what do you see that they should do in order to regain relevance?
Well, I mean, I think that they are going to go underground for about the next 5 years, right? They're probably going to go, basically they're moping right now. And I mean, that's not a big complaint of mine. It's just, I really am. And there's some people who are going to disagree with me on this and potentially some people who will be watching this, right? Who may be sort of quasi, at least ethno-nationalists. But I really am kind of finding it tedious, the people who just want to sit around and complain about Richard Spencer and Donald Trump all day and talk about, and also complain about the word alt-right. I mean, how more washed up can you get than talking about how the word alt-right and Richard Spencer's leadership and Donald Trump not being what you unrealistically expected him to be, being the cause of all your problems, right? Like that has to be the definition of moping. And I think it's going to probably continue on that trajectory for about 5 years until things. A lot of the trajectory is going to depend on whether or not Trump is reelected, right? That's obviously going to be an important factor. But I think that it's probably going to go underground for the next 5 years, and it's probably not going to emerge until there is some greater severity in the pressure that the cultural Marxists are applying to the society, which will require some kind of reaction. Now, at that point, the white nationalists could continue to alienate potential adjuncts by basically being overly dogmatic in their expectations of other people and trying to basically pressure other people into entertaining authoritarianism. And also insofar as they have any prospects of success, of providing a danger to the eventual outcome of the society's politics. Or they could seek to integrate their message into a broader opposition in which they can speak to the need to discuss the topics that they see as being in need of being discussed, and allow others to influence them in the same way, in ways that are just as necessary as it is for others to be influenced by them. And so to actually, the choice, the fork in the road is this. You can repeat what you did in 2017, or you can try to find some way of integrating yourself into a larger movement where people actually are able to admit that they may not have every answer to every single question, and where there are some higher resolution and more nuanced and synthetic images of what our potential solutions to the current problems might look like.
Okay. We're nearing the end of the hour. Is there anything else you'd want to leave us with before we wrap this up?
Yes. I would like to say that while I think that any discussion, any conversation should be able to be discussed in a free society, I would like to leave those who are most preoccupied with the JQ with this thought. Whatever you think of these three people, the alt-right as it came to exist and as it currently exists would not exist without the influences of Paul Gottfried, who coined the term, Mencius Moldbug, and Murray Rothbard. Right? These three people were key to the trajectory that was ultimately for the very existence of the movements in which you are now participating. And I would say that if you are correct about various cognitive disparities, then part of the reason why the people who you like to at whose feet you like to lay a lot of your grievances have been so prominent in the left is precisely because of their advantage in those specific cognitive arenas. And they are just as apt to rise to the top in dissident circles. And that's one of the reasons that you could make the argument that the actual founder of the alt-right, at least the alternative right, was in fact a Jew, Paul Gottfried. And so at the very least, it would probably be a good move to be less entrenched in this position and to be less dogmatic about it, because it is certainly not a cut and dry question. And it's one that is incredibly controversial and requires a good deal of finesse and nuance in terms of approaching it. And if you want anyone to even take the question seriously, you will have to proceed with that degree of finesse and what Jordan Peterson calls high resolution thinking. I would like to say, go ahead, Todd.
No, go ahead.
And I would just like to finish, in case we end up wrapping up early, that my channel is Right Ruminations, and you can find more of my material there, much of it relating to these topics. And I'd like to thank Todd for having me on and for continuing to do these conversations, which I think are necessary that these grounds be covered. So thank you, Todd, and back over to you.
Well, thank you, Right Ruminations. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.